if we think back to the 17th century, or if we can think back to the 17th century, the voyages of discovery, they really transformed our knowledge of the natural world, and well, they transformed the world. But perhaps what those voyages of discovery missed out was a real understanding of the natural world beneath the oceans. Fortunately, in the 4 centuries since, the technology of vessels has had a bit of an upgrade. And I think we've all been watching Blue Planet. Have we all been watching Blue Planet? Fantastic. So it just seems right that we should have Professor Alex Rogers, who's head of the Oceans Research and Conservation Lab in the university, talking about Nekton, these sort of the Nekton missions, which in some ways are the new voyages of discovery, and something which I think is an incredibly exciting development. So Alex, thanks for coming over. We'll pass over. I need to just flick this over now, don't we?
Yeah, there we go.
Sharp in second breath. Great. Over to you, Alex. Yeah.
Okay, let me just go back. Okay, folks, thanks ever so much, Paul, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming to listen this evening. It's really nice that Paul led off with this map of the ancient sort of, or not ancient, but old exploration routes, because I must say I was really disappointed when I read BBC website's science highlights for 2018 a couple of weeks ago. Every single one of them was related to space science, and the only one that wasn't related to space science was all about the British attempt on the land speed record. And I just thought, you know, why is it that all the public's attention is on space and space exploration, and we're spending billions on it, and yet we've basically explored about 0.0001% of the deep ocean, our inner space, if you like. And certainly back in the heroic age of exploration, those explorers that were going out around the world were probably the astronauts of their time, and were probably looked on in the same sense of heroism. So maybe one of Nekton's jobs here is to really re-inject that excitement into exploring the ocean. So I'm going to start with a very short film from Nekton. If you're wondering where the name came from, Nekton are the swimming organisms in the ocean. It also happens to be the name of the first mission to go to the deepest part of the ocean, which is the Challenger Deep in the Marianas Trench. It's about 11,000 meters deep. Only 3 people have been down there. 12 have been to the moon. So just an interesting thing to think about. Please work. Okay, so we'll leave Nekton there for a moment and start to talk about this thing, the deep ocean. What counts as deep ocean is everything that's deeper than 200 meters in depth. Although we're also interested in areas such as mesophotic coral reefs, which are the parts of shallow water reefs that run from 30 meters down to up to 150 meters also in depth. It's a huge ecosystem. So the volume of the ocean is about 1.3 billion cubic kilometers, has an average depth of 4,200 meters. So when I was diving back in 2016 to 3,380 meters, it was quite sobering to think that I hadn't even got to the average depth of the oceans in that submersible. We've explored about 0.0001% of this ecosystem, which is quite amazing given that it contains more than 90% of life on the planet. And here what we can see is essentially the way in which us biologists divide up this huge ecosystem, which is essentially by depth. So the upper 200 meters, the euphotic zone, that's where most of the primary production takes place. That's where we get sufficient sunlight for photosynthesis. Then down to 1,000 meters, the mesopelagic zone, which is where we can still measure at least some sunlight, and the animals that live there are specially adapted to these low light conditions. and then into the dark ocean, the bathypelagic, abyssopelagic, and finally into the trenches. And likewise, the seabed is divided up into continental shelf, which generally runs down to about 200 meters in depth, the continental slope, abyssal plains, and finally trenches and other features such as seamounts. If we look at the way in which us humans divide up the ocean, it's in quite a different way. So we'll see here we've got what's essentially treated the same as the land, known as territorial seas, out to 3 nautical miles from coastal baseline. Then we have the exclusive economic zone out to 200 nautical miles. This is where a coastal state has exclusive rights over the resources in that zone, and beyond that we have areas beyond national jurisdiction or the high seas. Just to confuse things, the water column is counted as high seas according to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, whereas the seabed is under a different legal jurisdiction and is known as the area. So we've done quite a good job of actually dividing up the ocean in terms of how we regulate and manage it and so on. And unfortunately, that's reflected in terms of some of the problems we face these days in ocean management. So this is our best kind of map of what the bottom of the ocean looks like. And I can tell you this is, although this has some of the kind of mega features which we know are there, when you actually come down to finer scales, such as diving in a submersible on a seamount, you suddenly find that the Admiralty charts are actually wrong. So a seamount that we thought was 400 or 500 meters from the surface to the summit turns out to actually be 1,000 meters to the summit, or a seamount whose edge you thought was in one place turns out to be 1 nautical mile away from where you thought it was. And this, as well as being a practical problem, really gets across just what a dearth of knowledge we have of this ecosystem. But what you'll see here is really vast areas of the deep ocean are these flat abyssal plains, and they look something like this. Doesn't look that exciting, but if you look closely you'll see all these kind of burrows and trail marks and so on. So this ecosystem is actually full of life, but most of the animals are really, really small, and they live either on or in the sediments of these abyssal plains. There are a few larger things wandering about. It's quite nice to sit and watch this video all the way through, because this octopus turns around and advances menacingly towards the remotely operated vehicle. But actually that's not the whole story of the deep sea. It has all the kind of landscape features that actually you'd associate with land. So we have mountains in the deep ocean, we have canyons or gullies. This is the Nazare Canyon off Portugal. You can see some video from it here. We have deep or cold water coral reefs, and we even have these in the waters off the UK at depths of 200 to 800-900 meters. And these are really rich hotspot ecosystems, all of these. So these contain habitats and species which are not found on the abyssal plains, for example. So there's a lot of variety in terms of habitat in the deep ocean. But to give you an idea of just how poorly explored these ecosystems are, these are some figures that I just pulled out of a report we published in 2015 for the European Marine Board. And you can see here deep water pelagic is the most poorly known ecosystem on Earth, probably. So this is the deep water column of the oceans. It's about 1 billion cubic kilometres, and we've seen less than 0.0001% of it. Even the best known deep sea ecosystems, deep sea hydrothermal vents, we know of where about 1/3 of them are, or we estimate we know where about 1/3 of them are, but we probably only visited 10% or less of those ecosystems. And you'll see things like seamounts, we've visited less than 0.002% of those. And what I'm showing here is basically the number of species records we have with depth. And these from the Ocean Biogeographic Information System, one of these large databases Paul was mentioning. And what you see here is between the surface and 1,000 metres, there's a huge drop in our understanding of just what's living there. And again, we see a really big drop again in data at 6,000 metres when we move from those abyssal depths into the ocean trenches. We are starting to understand something about the basic patterns of where life occurs in the deep ocean though, and a lot of the work which was done from the 1960s right through to the present has been done using this type of equipment. It's more or less Victorian technology. What this rather unwieldy looking piece of kit does is it's lowered to the seafloor and it takes a cubic bite of mud from the seafloor and hopefully brings it up in an unwashed out state back to the surface, and you wash the mud through a sieve using this very sophisticated looking dustbin, and you literally pick out the animals and identify them. So you've got a quantitative sample of what's there on the deep sea floor. As you can imagine, this takes a really long time, and Jessie up there at the back of the audience spent her DPhil looking at some of these types of samples. So we probably looked at a few football pitches worth of the deep sea, and I'm talking about the global deep sea scientific community with these types of studies. What they have told us though is that certainly biomass and abundance of life decreases with increasing depth. And the reason for that is food supply. Most of the primary production in the oceans happens in the upper 200 metres. That food rains down into the deep sea. It's been eaten all the time and degraded by bacteria. So the deeper you go, the less food there is. And for that reason, the abundance and biodiversity decreases with depth. And you can see that represented in this sort of cartoon here. We've got this primary production by phytoplankton. One of the big differences between the ocean and land is that the primary production occurs with microscopic organisms as opposed to plants and trees. And dead phytoplankton and dead bodies of anything from small zooplankton to a whale drop into the deep ocean, and that's what keeps everything going down there. Interestingly, species richness has a very different pattern. And what we see with species richness is essentially a parabolic shaped curve with depth. So diversity actually increases as we go down to mid-slope depths and then declines again. These are data for polychaete worms, annelid worms from off Rockall. Here are data for a wider range of taxa, so snails, polychaete worms, fish and so on. And you'll see that although the pattern differs slightly from group to group, we're seeing this same parabolic pattern of diversity with depth. We're not entirely sure why this pattern is the way it is, but we think it's connected again to food supply. So in shallow water where there's lots of food, you get lots of competitive exclusion by a few members of the community which really dominate it in terms of biomass or abundance. And as we go into deeper water, the food supply drops off and we get less and less of that competitive exclusion and more coexistence of species. So the diversity goes up, and when we get deeper still, because that food supply has really dropped away by this time, food becomes really limiting and diversity decreases as we go deeper and deeper after that. So what, you might say? Well, if I'm talking to policymakers, the language they understand is essentially what does this ecosystem do for us? What might it do for our economies and so on? And the deep ocean provides many ecosystem services for the planet, for humankind, just as with any other ecosystem. Some of these are really obvious services, such as the provision of food in terms of fisheries, but others are really much less obvious, so biogeochemical cycling, thermoregulation and so on. And even though these things are very, very difficult to actually value in monetary terms, essentially what you're looking at here are the foundations of the operating of the Earth system, or the Earth's life support system. Now, we do obviously exploit this ecosystem. Even the deep sea is subject to exploitation. And in fact, now that many countries are thinking about their blue economy and blue growth, the deep sea is receiving greater and greater attention in terms of exploitation. Already, since the 1960s, we've had industrial fishing in the deep ocean. We're now looking at new industries such as deep sea mining, which is being looked at down to depths of 4,000 or 5,000 metres in areas like the Pacific, Clarion Clifton fracture zone. Hydrothermal vents are a target for deep sea mining, seamounts for cobalt crusts, a whole variety of different ecosystems. We're also thinking about the deep ocean in terms of disposal of carbon dioxide, as a source of biotechnology, and even tourism. So there are tourist submersibles, places like Roatan in Honduras, where you can pay a guy with a submersible to drop a dead horse into the deep sea, and you go and follow it down and see the six-gilled sharks come in and eat the unfortunate horse. But the deep sea works in a very, very different way to shallow water ecosystems. And I just threw up this slide because I think it really conveys just how different life is in the deep sea. So this is a deep sea sponge which occurs in the East China Sea, and it's a very unusual sponge because it has these huge spicules. These are the skeletal elements of the sponge, and essentially by taking slices through these spicules as you would through a tree and looking at the tree rings, these animals have been aged to 11,000 years. So they're probably amongst the oldest organisms on Earth, or at least the organisms with the longest lifespan. Likewise, deep sea corals have been aged at up to more than 4,000 years. Well, then you go to something like the orange ruffy here, my favourite fish for various reasons. Fortunately, he's gone a very strange colour on this screen. But these live to 150 years. They don't mature until they're 30 or 40 years old. They don't reproduce every year because they're in an energy limited environment. And it's this energy limitation and also the fact that when these animals get to a certain size, their rates of natural mortality are incredibly low. So life really moves in the slow lane in the deep ocean. And as you can imagine, when you start to destroy or exploit populations of these types of animals, their vulnerability to overexploitation is extremely high, and their ability to recover from damage is very poor. So what we have here is a graph of the trend in the average depth of fishing with the European fishing fleet running from 1950 to 2010, and you can see that the mean depth of fishing, these are fisheries for deep water species, has been increasing through time. And in fact now they're fishing down to depths of 2,000 to 3,000 metres in some parts of the world. And they've traditionally targeted species like this orange ruffy. And I'll just show you one example of one of these orange ruffy fisheries. This was taking place off the coast of Ireland. And you can see here that for about 10 years the catches were fairly stable at around 1,000 tonnes per year for this stock. What happened then was the Irish government invested taxpayers' money in refitting the fleet to target these orange ruffy rather than to kind of fish them incidentally. And of course, because they had better technology and better gear, the catches leapt up, but then within 2 years the stock was crashed. So you had upset fishermen because their boats had been fitted out for this type of fishing. The fish had gone. You had upset taxpayers because their investment in this fishery was a waste of money. And you had upset people like me because they'd basically completely wrecked the stock, not to mention the environmental damage which potentially came with it. And this is what I'm talking about here. Orange roughy, when they're threatened, dive for the seabed. So the way they're actually fished is using bottom trawls. Now these bottom trawls have been developed for fishing on rugged ground. They have big steel doors, and they have rollers so that they bounce over boulders and so on. Unfortunately, the types of habitat where the orange roughy occur are also home to this type of habitat. This is a coldwater coral reef on the South Australian seamounts, which lie to the south of Tasmania. And here you can see this really amazing reef framework with all sorts of other animals living on it, probably at a depth of somewhere between 1,000 to 1,500 metres. This is a seamount that was actually fished in the same area. And you can see this would have been covered in this coldwater coral reef. The reef's been completely obliterated, and certainly up to now, and we're talking about several decades later, there's been no sign of recovery of these ecosystems following this type of exploitation. And you can really see the type of damage that's done here by these trawls. This is a photograph that Greenpeace took or got hold of from one of these, this was a New Zealand trawler, and you can see the size of this bubblegum coral here that's been brought on board. It has been thousands and thousands of years old, and you can see it's been taken out by this trawl, and obviously the recovery, if it occurs at all, is going to be measurable in hundreds, if not thousands of years for that habitat. So deep sea fishing is actually almost a legacy industry. It's been going on for a long, long time. Well, for at least 40 or 50 years now in the deep ocean, but now we're seeing new types of industrial activity, as I mentioned. These are deep sea hydrothermal vents, so this is at a depth of about 2,500 metres on the East Scotia Ridge in Antarctica. What you see here are vent chimneys spewing this fluid here, which is black because basically that fluid is full of polymetallic sulfides. So these vents are actually pumping out metallic sulfides into the environment, and this precipitate here contains very high concentrations of metals like copper, gold, silver, zinc, and various other rather useful things which end up in mobile phones and so on. This is a piece of one of these chimneys, and you can see that it's actually made up almost of solid copper sulfide, actually sort of layering the inside of the chimney. This machine is currently out on sea trials in Papua New Guinea, and the aim is to commence mining deep sea hydrothermal vents at depths of about 1,500 metres within the waters of PNG. This is very handy because the mining company only has to do with a deal with the Papua New Guinea government. It doesn't have to deal with the UN International Seabed Authority, which regulates mining on the high seas. And it's not just hydrothermal vents that are being looked at as a source of deep sea minerals. We also have manganese nodules, vast areas of these lying in areas of the abyssal plains, such as the mid-Pacific, cobalt crusts on seamounts, marine phosphates, which tend to occur in areas with high surface primary production. So there are potential benefits here, obviously, economic benefits measured in billions, but of course there are also potential environmental impacts. The hydrothermal vents themselves have a very high level of endemism in the fauna. More than 70% endemic species occur in these vent ecosystems, but these mining operations have the potential to affect the areas outside of the vents as well, in terms of the sediment plumes and so on, which are generated from these activities. At the moment in the high seas, or in the area, the International Seabed Authority is busily giving out licenses to explore large areas of the deep ocean for marine minerals. So you see here, this is a map of the Clarion Clifton fracture zone area. I forget the exact area of this, but it's a vast area, you know, more than the area of France or large chunks of Europe. We have various other areas around the world. This is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. This is the Pacific Seamounts. And here we've got the Indian Ocean, where various areas are being licensed for this mining exploration. So we're in a situation where we've had these legacy industries which have been poorly managed out in the deep ocean, and we're now facing a new wave of exploitation of deep ocean resources. And this is really where Nekton start to come in. One of the big problems we have is a lack of understanding, a lack of knowledge about where life occurs in the deep sea and how deep sea ecosystems actually work. And as I said, we know that there's a peak of biodiversity somewhere on mid-slope depths. So this is why Nekton has really honed in on this region between 200 to 2,000 to 3,000 metres as the centre of our interest. It's where we know there's this peak of biodiversity. It's also where much of this activity in terms of exploitation of deep sea resources is potentially going to take place. We're also interested in mesophotic coral reef ecosystems. This is obviously a picture from shallow water coral reef, this one in the Red Sea, but most people don't know that these reefs actually continue on into deep water down to at least somewhere between 150 to 160 metres depth. So you get zooxanthellate, in other words light harvesting corals, down well into the euphotic zone, down to at least, as I said, 150 metres. And these may be very, very important because many coral or reef-forming coral species are depth generalists, and this means that when their populations are wiped out in shallow water by, for example, a mass bleaching event, there may be a refuge population lying in deeper water just off the coast of that reef. So it's really important to understand what is down on these mesophotic reefs and also what the connectivity is between shallow and deeper water reefs in these tropical regions. So coming back to our bathyal zone, what do we actually want to do? Well, to put it simply, what we want to do is undertake a series of global expeditions where we sample all of the predicted bioregions of the bathyal zone across all of the oceans. So these bioregions are essentially generated by modelling which looks at the physical conditions of the ocean and really clusters across areas which have similar physical conditions. So you can see here there are 14 of these bioregions globally for the bathyal zone, and we want to visit every single one of those locations, preferably multiple times, to really cause a step change in our understanding of distribution of life in these areas and also how it's connected. We want to do this science in a very different way. Obviously, because we want to work globally across large areas, we have to try and standardise the protocols that we're using so they're the same on every single mission. You might think it quite surprising, but the biologists have not managed to do this yet. The oceanographers do it, so they have standard protocols and ways of taking their measurements. The biologists have not done this up to now. So we held an international workshop recently where we actually have standardised these protocols, and this standardised framework is actually just about to appear in the journal Oceanography. So we got together a bunch of scientists from around the world and really came to agreement over what needed to be in this framework, and it's now being designed and put together. The other thing we wanted to do was to really accelerate discovery. So we minimised the time from the expedition to data production and then putting the data into the hands of policymakers, NGOs and whoever else was able to actually enact in terms of sustainable management based on those data. And I'm very pleased to say that after the first expedition, which was in Bermuda in August 2016, the first paper appeared less than 12 months from the end of the expedition. And the bulk of the rest of the papers are going to appear within the next 6 months. So basically that's more or less an 18-month span between the expedition and most of the important papers in that expedition coming out. We are also very interested in basically making sure our data are available to as wide an audience as possible. So we have a big data project called Octopus, which I'll come to in a second. We also have a number of other technology projects, including using DNA approaches for assessing biodiversity in these ecosystems, and also using machine learning, artificial intelligence approaches to really accelerate our ability to analyse image data, so videos, photographs and so on. Alongside that, there's a major capacity building programme in terms of bringing scientists from the nearest coastal states onto our expeditions, training them in the Nekton standardised protocols, and really making sure that we leave behind a legacy of trained scientists in the region following any expedition. We make sure our work, as I said, is of direct policy relevance, and there's a huge education and public outreach programme alongside this, which I'll come to in a minute. So, just to talk in a tiny bit more detail about our big data project, Octopus. This stands for Ocean Tool for Public Understanding in Science. This is basically a tool which we put all our data into from Nekton projects, but also it dynamically harvests data from a huge range of other ocean data sets. At the moment, it houses about 98 billion data points, and that's everything from oceanographic data to biodiversity data and so on. And the really clever bit here is that these data are harmonised so they can all be analysed using the same framework. And the database is also dynamically updated. So it's linked, for example, into the Ocean Biogeographic Information System. If OBIS is updated by its people, Octopus automatically harvests those new data. So we have a big data project here with Octopus, and Peter was really helpful in terms of thinking through how to actually do this. So we had our first mission, the Sargasso Sea in Bermuda, in August 2016, about 18 months ago. And just to point out that this is Bermuda. It's basically the top of a huge volcano. Just to the southwest of it, there are two seamounts, which are also ex-volcanoes. And the island and the archipelago is a huge system of tiny islands, some of them linked by bridges so people can get around on them. And we had two parts of this mission. One of them, the Baseline Explorer, was based around Bermuda itself, doing submersible dives, diver surveys, other sampling work. And then we had this, I must say, very old ship, the Canadian vessel, the Hudson, which did several transects across the Sargasso Sea, and you can see here, from Canada to Bermuda, and undertook physical oceanographic work looking at climate change effects on the Gulf Stream, but also looking at some aspects of deep sea ecology as well. So I'm not going to say too much about the Hudson now, other than, as I said, there was a lot of work done on oceanography and also on plankton communities on the Hudson cruise. But also we did this work in areas which were known to be interesting in terms of biodiversity on the Canadian continental slope and some of the seamounts in the region. One of the first findings that popped out from this was the finding that deep shelf depressions actually contain deep sea species in shallow water. So there seems to be something odd going on in these depressions off Canada in terms of upwelling of deep sea water onto the shelf and deposition of the larvae of some of these deep water species. So we've got a paper in submission on that. But turning to the actual Bermuda mission, one of the really important things about Nekton was actually putting people into the deep sea to do this work. This is a Triton Submersible. This is one of their light submersibles. It only goes down to about 300 meters in depth. Generally, these are used by people with luxury yachts as a kind of, I don't know, tourist plaything, I guess. But they make absolutely fabulous science platforms, and that is because they're highly manoeuvrable. They've got lots of bits where you can basically glue, bolt, or screw bits of scientific equipment to, and they enable you to survey types of terrain which would be really, really difficult using robots and other types of technology. So what you can see here is us just moving along the slope of Bermuda, actually doing survey work with stereo cameras pointing forwards to survey the fish communities, and another camera pointing downwards with laser scaling so we can survey the animal communities living on the seabed. And we also had technical divers who were doing essentially the same thing. You'll notice there are no bubbles coming from this chap. It's not because he's about to expire, it's because he's actually using basically a rebreather system. It's a mixed gas rebreather system. These guys were down, an average dive was 7 hours for these teams, and they were surveying down to depths of 90 meters. So this is really, really technically demanding work. But what you'll see is that he's actually doing exactly the same as we were doing on the submersibles. So stereo cameras, fish community surveys and seabed community surveys along these transects. So we had data that was comparable right from 15 metres all the way down to 300 metres. So what do we do after we've gathered all these data? Well, we bring it back to the Begbroke Nekton Science Lab, and we have to analyse the data, much of which is in the form of image data, so video data. And what we do with the videos is we cut it into stills, and each still is then analysed using coral point count. We actually measure the area covered by the encrusting animals, count the numbers of mobile species, and we end up generating numbers out of these image data. This takes a really long time, and this is why we're so keen on developing machine learning or AI methods for actually analysing these types of data sets. The stereo video data are analysed using special software called Event Measure, which is a commercial software used for counting the abundance and biomass of fish. And the biomass we can derive from the lengths of the fish. And there are standard conversion factors for fish species to convert those length measurements to biomass measurements. So what did we discover? Well, this was one of the first discoveries that basically all around Bermuda and around those seamounts I showed to the south, there are these gardens of black corals. Nobody in Bermuda knew that these were actually there. So this completely new habitat in terms of what was known, which is quite incredible when you think there is an oceanographic centre on Bermuda. They clearly hadn't bothered to look at the deep sea at all in the last 100 years or so while they've been there. But we found these black coral forests. They were associated with a lot of diversity in terms of the other animals associated with them, and that went down to the actual corals themselves. We found 7 species of black corals. 3 of those species were new records for Bermuda. 1 of them, in those deep water black coral gardens, was a new species. So these are not small things. These corals grow up to 2 or 3 meters in height, and they've clearly been there for a very long time. So this was a very important habitat forming group. We also analysed the fish communities using these stereo videos. That sound you hear in the background there are the thrusters from the submersible. And you see just one example of what we found. This is a moray eel, which was one of the most common predators down at 200 to 300 metres. This is an animal you usually associate with shallow coral reefs. We think it's a species called Gymnothorax madeirensis, and there are scattered records of it all around the North Atlantic, and as you can guess from the name, it was first described from Madeira. But as I said, what we're able to do by dragging these numbers out of the video data is really look in some detail at these fish communities going down the slope. So you can see the depth here along the x-axis for these graphs, and here you see the fish abundance, the fish biomass, and then here this is the species richness. So there's a fairly clear pattern here in terms of really sharp decline in fish biomass with depth. The actual numbers you can see really bounce around much more. There's a less of a relationship there to depth, but what this probably tells you, if you're thinking about it, is that things are getting much smaller as you're getting deeper here. And again, the patterns with species richness are also less simple than biomass. We seem to have this peak down at what's that, about 30 to 60 meters, and then the diversity drops off. Looking at these fish communities using PCA here in this case really sorts those communities out into some pretty distinct groups, and those groups are essentially distinguished by depth. So we have a distinct fish community in shallow water reefs, then distinct communities down at the upper mesophotic depths, and then the lower mesophotic and sub-mesophotic communities form another distinct community. And these communities were patterned in the same way regardless of where you were around Bermuda. The only difference seemed to be with the seamount stations we actually looked at. And we've also looked at the sort of dominant trophic groups with different depths. And one of the interesting things which has popped out here is the really rapid disappearance of herbivores with depth. So you can see here in green, these are the herbivorous fish, and you can see that by 60 meters, there are almost no herbivorous fish left in the community. And we've switched over to things like zooplanktivores, which are in black here, they're in red on my screen, it's a little confusing. But these herbivores disappear at 60 meters, and you might be thinking, why is he telling us about this? Well, it's for this reason. This is the summit of Argus Bank, the seamount to the southwest of Bermuda, and this is at a depth of about 60 to 70 meters, and you can see it's festooned in this forest of algae. And this is a species called Spirochnus. You can see it forms this really distinct habitat at this depth. But when we started to look at our samples collected by the divers and also the submersible, we found a whole range of new algal species down at these mesophotic depths. And we think what's going on here is that basically because the herbivores drop out at a depth of about 60 meters, these algae actually have a refuge from herbivory at these depths. So this is one of the new ones, Cryptonemia abyssalis. Here's some more. This is Galeni, Saramenia. And when I show you the world distribution of Saramenia, you can see here it's around Bermuda, and then there are some records here off Australia and New Zealand. What that tells us is that, in fact, there's very, very little known about these mesophotic algal communities. Yeah?
What is your theory then of the herbivorous?
Basically, there's no herbivorous fish at these depths.
Why? So,
because there's...
You would think that they would move downwards if there was food, but...
Yeah, there's probably not enough though.
Okay.
Yeah, there's insufficient algal material for them to actually make a living at those depths. So that means that there is this refugia for algae at these depths. Primary production declines with depth, obviously, because the light levels decline. Another source of really undocumented diversity were the associates of animals like the corals and the sponges. So when we took samples of these things, we'd get them up into the container lab on the ship and pick all the critters off them, and what we find is a massive range of undescribed diversity. So you can see here just this group of small microarthropods, teneids. We've got more than 12 new species from this single expedition, which have come out of sponge and coral samples. So there's this whole other world of diversity there. This was another finding, and you'll see in this video this fish, which is a new record for Bermuda. It's called Darwin's slimehead. But also here, and very difficult to see, there's actually a lionfish. So this is an invasive species in the Caribbean. No, it's there. That's it. You can see it there a bit better. And we discovered the deepest records of lionfish found anywhere in the Caribbean. So we were very surprised to get down to 300 meters depth, and the first thing we saw were lionfish down at those depths. So these animals are non-native. They're eating their way through the native fish fauna, and we know now that they're there at sub-mesophotic depths, preying on the fauna. So policy impacts of this were, well, we were involved in the launching of a new UNESCO World Heritage Report on the high seas during the expedition. There's been a reinitiation of discussions on development of marine protected areas around Bermuda as a result of this expedition. In May of this year, we now have an Oceans Risks meeting in Bermuda, sponsored by XL Catlin, and the Bermudian government has really also been kicked off as a result of this expedition. And you know, we've ended up being involved in discussions around a new implementing agreement for the UN Convention on Law of the Sea on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And just say something about the public outreach and education efforts here. We estimate that the media outreach reached 750 million people from this expedition. And the reason we were able to reach so many people is we actually took journalists and writers and so on down in the submersibles with us and out on the expedition. And that gave us huge reach in terms of the media globally. In terms of education, we got involved with a company called Digital Explorer, who produce these really excellent STEM education materials from scientific expeditions. So we have a range of these materials. They're all available on the Nekton website if you want to have a look at any of those. So now towards the end, I'm just briefly going to talk about Nekton Mission 2, and this is aimed at the Indian Ocean. And the reason we're so keen to go to the Indian Ocean is because it's probably the least understood and least explored ocean in the world. And I would even include the Southern Ocean in terms of that, that comparison. So it's become known as the forlorn ocean. And you'll see here, this is the track that was taken by the Challenger expedition in the 1870s, which was the kind of birth of modern oceanography. And you'll see that the Challenger actually managed to kind of steer around the Indian Ocean and completely failed to sample it. So even back in the Challenger days, for some reason, the Indian Ocean was not a high priority for oceanography. And it's remained the same until today, and it's not been helped by things like piracy and so on going on in certain parts of the ocean. So it's the third largest ocean globally, 20% of the ocean area, but importantly about 2 billion people live around the margins of the Indian Ocean. So it's of huge importance in terms of people. Development of the blue economy is seen as a priority in the region. Many island states, such as the Seychelles, are really putting a lot of thought into how they can exploit the ocean, hopefully in a sustainable way. The place is really neglected in terms of funding. So I just put up here, less than 2% of the 8.5 billion of the financial commitments of the Our Oceans meeting in Malta last year was actually dedicated to the Indian Ocean. So it's really a neglected place in many ways. So we've identified 6 areas which take us across the whole of the Indian Ocean and enable us to sample biodiversity at mesophotic and bathyal depths throughout longitude of the Indian Ocean. We did choose these places on the basis of science, not nice places to go, I hasten to add. They might sound really glorious, but I can tell you from personal experience, it can be really rough working out in some of these areas. I've worked in the Indian Ocean in several places. This is the southwest Indian Ridge, where we worked on a cruise in 2009-2011. The first cruise was aimed at looking at the pelagic biodiversity associated with seamounts in the region. These seamounts have been the targets of some of this deep water fishing in the area. We found an extremely high pelagic diversity in the region. This is one example of the pelagic cephalopods, the squids, and the octopus. We sampled something like 10 to 11% of all the diversity of pelagic cephalopods on one expedition of 4 weeks in this region. Why is it so attractive in terms of fisheries? Well, it's because of these seamounts, and we think what's driving these systems is what's called the topographic blockage hypothesis. So we have these layers of micronekton and zooplankton which migrate up and down in the ocean every day. So as it gets dark, they migrate up into shallow water to feed, and at dawn they dive back down into the deep sea. And what happens when you have a big seamount in the way is that they get stuck on the top of it, and the seamount resident predators, some of which you can see here, feed on that trapped zooplankton and micronekton. And these are exactly the species that are targeted by commercial fishing fleets fishing in deep waters on these seamounts. This is an Alfonsino, and this is a pelagic armhead. Fortunately, we did find cold water coral reefs on these seamounts, so they haven't all been destroyed by this deep water trawling. This is a picture from Coral Seamount in this region. You can see this really amazing framework of cold water corals with all these sorts of other organisms living on it. And this is associated with a really high level of novel biodiversity. So we found, in fact, many of the large species of corals and sponges and so on we found were new species. This is one that incidentally was named after my wife, Narella candidae, so there are some plus points of doing this work within your own lab. This is one that somebody else named after me, Chondrocladia rogersi. It's actually a carnivorous sponge. Not sure what that says about their opinion of me, but these things have special sclerites which trap the legs of crustaceans and allow the sponge to kind of absorb them in an alien horror movie type fashion. Unfortunately, we also found evidence of human impacts. So you can see here these huge numbers of lost lobster pots on a seamount, literally in the middle of nowhere. Nobody knew this fishery was going on, and I can tell you this seamount is 5 or 6 days steam at full speed from the nearest land, hundreds and hundreds of nautical miles away from the nearest port. You can see these lobster pots here. This is what they were actually after, these large spiny lobsters. We didn't know they were there until this expedition, but clearly the fishing fleets had found them. This one is caught in a ghost net. You can see it's kind of dying there. It's wrapped in this monofilament net, and we found lots of evidence of fishing-related debris in this region. The other discovery was related to this, and this is obviously a fisherman's glove. It's a bit of a mixed message, this, because you can see this fish has found a home underneath this glove. But the main point of this slide is that in all of the sediment samples we sampled down to 1,500 metres, we found microplastic fibres in every single sample and draped all over the corals as well. So out of this came a paper, in fact the first paper really identifying the problem of microplastics in the deep ocean. The other habitat we have in the Indian Ocean that I've been working on are deep sea hydrothermal vents. You'll see here in February 2016 we were diving in the Yokosuka, a Japanese submersible, on hydrothermal vents in the southwest Indian Ocean. This is a kind of view from out the submersible, so you just get a little 20 centimetre porthole and something that looks like a space capsule inside. It's about 2 metres across inside this thing. We're down at about 3,000 metres there. It gets quite uncomfortable after 7 or 8 hours, I can tell you. But these are the types of systems that occur there, and these are the targets of these mining exploration operations that are happening at the moment. These things, which you probably can't make out too well there, are these. These are hydrothermal vent shrimps. They actually grow chemosynthetic bacteria on their appendages and feed off them. The bacteria are chemoautotrophs, so they actually oxidize hydrogen sulfide, which is in the vent fluid, to produce energy. So this whole ecosystem is based on chemical energy as opposed to sunlight. So what's the timeline for Mission 2? Well, we aim to start this year, November, December, with the Seychelles, and then move through the next 3 to 4 years, ending with the State of the Indian Ocean Summit, which will be here in Oxford. We've set ourselves what look like some fairly scary targets, but actually, given what's come out of the Bermuda expedition already, these seem to me to be fairly attainable. So 600 scientific papers, 10 million DNA sequences, 150 Indian Ocean ambassadors, a global reach of 1.5 billion people, and so on. So we really have to be very ambitious in terms of what we're actually doing. You know, this is what Paul was talking about in terms of having this major ambition in terms of biodiversity science. So where are we actually now? Well, we're fundraising. We have a partnership with a major tourism company, Kensington Tours, and we're currently in negotiations with a major corporate partner for several tens of millions of funding to fund these expeditions over the next 3 to 4 years. We're also talking to partners in terms of the technology innovation projects as well. We're already moving into the phase of mission planning, getting the right ship into the area, the right equipment, the submersibles, the right people, and we're starting to raise awareness that this is going to happen by contacting people in the region, so other expeditions, policy makers, NGOs, and so on. And also there's what's called the International Indian Ocean Expedition 2, which we're now a part of. So just to summarise all that, Nekton aims to explore the deep ocean, specifically the bathyal and mesophotic zones. We really require these standardised approaches to do this. We want to accelerate our science and make sure that the data are accessible and instantly translatable into policy change. Nekton Mission 1 to Bermuda and the Sargasso Sea was a real success. It showed us that we could actually do this, and also means that when we go to funders, you know, we're not starting from a base of zero. We can actually say, you know, we know how to do this, it's worked. First paper was published less than 12 months after the expedition. The rest are going to go in the next 2 months, at least from our team. And Mission 2's focus is on the Indian Ocean, as I said, and we'll build on the methods developed in Mission 1 through our standardised sampling framework, which will be published shortly. So that's it.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, that was fantastic, wasn't it? Part of it is all about, oh heck, the oceans. But I think, Alex, you're really telling us that maybe with technology you can accelerate science.
Yeah, and one of the things that typically happens after a deep sea expedition is that all our scientists go back to our labs and spend literally years working the data up. There's often a lack of time pressure to get that scientific result out, so it can be 4, 5, even 10 years after the expedition when the papers actually come out, and by then obviously things have moved on, so it's really important to accelerate science and get it out as quickly
Is
as
this because we've
possible.
got technology and power destruction going on what, you know, that massive digger you showed?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, what was there when you were doing the expedition might be gone by the time you actually get the science out.
What I suggest we do is sort of have 10 or 15 minutes of discussion, and then those who are interested, hoping maybe some of Alex's lab can come along, they'll go down to the university club and have a beer and talk a little bit more. But you know, someone lead us in with a question or reflection or something you were thinking about listening to Alex talking.
I was just wondering if you could kind of expand a little bit more on the policy implications, because obviously what's going on with the oceans is we're at a critical point and we need to be acting very quickly, and that's going to involve a huge amount of policy overturn and a lot of multilateral environmental agreements on it. Is the science that is coming out is obviously very quick, but do you think the policy is going to be able to respond fast enough for the response that the oceans actually require?
Oh, good one. We can accelerate science. Can we accelerate policy, Alex?
The simple answer to that is that now is the right time. In December, the UN actually agreed to enter into these biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction discussions. Those discussions are going to take place, and this is to develop a new implementing agreement for UNCLOS to protect biodiversity in the high seas. So those discussions are going to take place over the next 2-3 years. So we're really at the right point to be feeding into those high-level discussions about international waters. When you pull it back to coastal states and their EEZs, again, we're right at the point where many of these states, and the Seychelles is a really good example, Mauritius is another one, are really now looking towards the ocean as a new way to supplement or improve their economy, employ people and so on. The problem is that they simply do not know what is out there below 30 metres depth. So some of the things that have happened in that region are they're encouraging more deep water fishing off reefs into these mesophotic reef environments. They do not have a clue what is actually there, apart from very big groupers, which, you know, have a very high value and are good to eat. So there's no idea about the, you know, often population size with these fish, what environment they're living in, and so on and so forth. And of course, often these things will be targeted in spawning areas and so on, which means that the fishing pressure can be extraordinarily high and lead to depletion very quickly.
But
So just
on that one though, you say
Yeah.
that we've got this policy window, but it sounds like it's here now and we're only just mobilising. Could
It
that
is-
be a bad thing? Could it be better if it was 8
Yeah.
years down the road? We could bloody miss it.
Yeah, I think we are at the right time. I mean, they are talking about it now, but it's over the next few years that it's going to be implemented.
Great.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lisa?
So it looks amazing, the Nekton project, but it's also phenomenally expensive, and it's clearly a very ambitious program to sample these 40 metres around the world.
yeah.
I just wonder what your reflection is on whether your big expensive ships and submersibles and expeditions could be superseded in the course of this program by things like autonomous ocean gliders and sampling methods like that. Where's the value inflection?
The droids.
Expensive versus
Yeah.
the sort of
We're a big fan of droids, and if we can kick 40 droids over the side of the ship and get our data, we'll do it. And part of Nekton's sort of outlook is using these new technologies wherever we can to improve our ability to collect data and achieve our objectives. The problem is that in many cases those technologies at the moment are incipient, or they have limited capabilities for doing the biology. So, for example, we have some very good autonomous underwater vehicles at the moment. AutoSub is an example in the UK. They're fantastic for collecting oceanographic data. They're absolutely hopeless for collecting biological data. And in fact, the operators hate doing biology because we generally tell them to fly the things close to the seabed to take video or pictures, and the problem with that is they then bump their AUV into a seamount or get it trapped under a ledge or some other disaster and they don't get it back. So the technology has not reached the point yet where it's sufficiently developed to actually do the biology work. It
What's your
is.
assessment? How far off are we on the, these droids going down?
I would say 10, 20 years probably.
Oh, 20 years?
Yeah, yeah.
10, 20 years?
Yeah, the other issue here is how expensive the things are. So
And
for
research
me,
money going in.
yeah, well, just in terms of purchasing the individual units.
Yeah.
So ideally what we need are cheap, small things that we can chuck into the ocean, get data back from them. I know it sounds rather callous, especially when we're all thinking about plastics in the ocean, but if they don't come back, it's not a disaster. There is a good chance whenever you chuck anything over the side of a ship that it isn't going to come back. So, we have to bear those sorts of things in mind when we're using these types of technology. Having said that, the AUVs and so on are really good for collecting things like the physical ocean data that we want to collect. And in fact, having said all that, we're going to the Antarctic next year to deploy 6 autonomous underwater vehicles in an array to survey the seabed under the Larsen ice shelf, or what's left of it. So,
Yeah, thanks a lot for your talk, Alex.
Yeah,
It's
cheers.
really fascinating. I had a question on the opening slide, which you started saying, talking about sort of all the different social and economic values that ocean ecosystems can provide. And I guess I was just wondering if one of these deep ocean expeditions has already turned up sort of like a biological discovery with potential great implications.
Yes.
Which could perhaps also help in mobilizing
Yeah.
funding.
Yeah, well, I always point to the discovery of deep sea hydrothermal vents in 1977, so that is a relatively recent occurrence. The discovery of vents really told us that you could have ecosystems independent of sunlight. They also extended our knowledge of the conditions in which life could occur. That single discovery completely kicked off the whole science of astrobiology and our understanding of where life might occur in the universe.
Why?
So that is an example of a single deep sea discovery which, more or less changed our perspective on where life may occur, not only in the solar system but beyond.
Yeah. There's a gent at the back. Yeah, sorry, you. Not
yeah,
right at the back, nearly at the back.
question about technologies being superseding your technology. You can imagine a situation where you have a kind of Craig Bentner kind of character, you might call Captain Nemo or something, who develops his own fleet of robotic submersibles which are capable of sucking out water, doing environmental DNA analysis, also environmental RNA analysis, and dramatically ramping up the amount of data produced. They could use that to generate ocean-wide, just running grids all across the oceans and generating huge amounts of data, but also using it more in a more targeted way, just using maybe RNA to look for fish, desirable fish species, fish in certain stages of reproductive cycle, that kind of thing, and that the blue economy is then fueled by this kind of rampant capitalist corporate kind of approach.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a difficult one. I mean, we are, one of our technology projects is really looking at eDNA approaches to assessing biodiversity. We're working with Oxford Nanopore on that project, so it's quite useful being in Oxford for those types of approaches. But those technologies in particular, might go a very long way, and as you say, they could be used to actually, to negative purposes. We've already seen that in terms of ocean mapping. So when I first came to work on the Indian Ocean, there were no maps, or we couldn't find any multi-beam maps of the seamounts which we were wanting to work on. We discovered that the fishing industry had already mapped every single one of those seamounts in great detail. So that was an example where, commercial industry had the technology there at their fingertips to map where they wanted to fish. They went out and did it. We didn't have those maps, and they wouldn't give them to us either, because they viewed it as commercially sensitive information. So that's a real danger. That danger extends to us even having to think very, very carefully about the information that we release about certain things that we're likely to find. So that's a really, really complicated area, because obviously what I want to do is just make all of the data we gather globally available. But if we find, say, a spawning aggregation of some very valuable grouper or whatever at mesophotic reef depths, do we release that information? And that becomes a very difficult decision, because if we do, there's a good chance somebody's going to go there and hoover them up. So
that's a good one to think about. What a conundrum. Well, let's have one last question just to finish off. Any burning ones here? Oh, you put your hand down there. It doesn't have to be burning, just a nice one to finish off.
Thanks, Alex, for that talk. I think it's incredible that you're going to look at the Indian Ocean, and I was just wondering whether any of the countries within the ocean have approached Nekton's mission to fund. For instance, I know India is looking incredibly at deep sea mining, specifically for manganese nodules, as well as for our deep sea fisheries. But they're quite pathetic when it comes to mapping, because they're not funding much of this work that's relevant to biodiversity.
yeah,
So do you feel like they'd probably be willing to fund, or do you feel they...
I think we would have a very difficult time extracting funding from governments in the region. Indian government in particular has traditionally not funded much work in this area. They are funding the mining prospecting work in the deep ocean. And we know there are deep water fisheries in India. There's zero knowledge about what's being caught, how much of it, or where, or anything. Our funding is really coming from private sources, so corporations, wealthy individuals, foundations. And in fact, whereas if I'd spoken to you 10 years ago, I would say 95% of my funding would have come from research councils. Now that percentage is more like a third. And if we achieve our objectives with Nekton, that will drop to probably less than 10% of my funding coming from research council sources. So, and one of the reasons for that is that we really have to upscale our ambitions in terms of ocean science if we're to make any dent in terms of the knowledge base that we have now. So we're talking about space science scale funding and space science scale missions which are lasting 10, 20 years, not 3 years, which is the traditional length of a research grant.
Okay, well, Alex, I think probably we'd all just like to congratulate you and all of your team on just what you've been achieving. I mean, it's an interesting one because it's a blend of just being so, wow, just fascinating, these voyages of discovery, and yet also so bloody important as well. I mean, just, my goodness, it's about such an important aspect of our planet, and it sounds like, technology is helping achieve these things. So thanks for coming along, and thanks for giving us such a great start to the lecture series. Thanks ever so much.